Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. And again, this is going to be a podcast during this time. I'm sure you'll forgive me, that has no editing to it, which means that we have to just kind of cope with doorbells and dogs and all of those things that make home working a reality for all of those people that are living with that at the moment. So I'm sure you'll forgive me for that. But it's in the interest of getting these programs out as quickly as possible during COVID-19. So today I'm really excited. I have with me patron of BASW, that's British Association for Social Work, for those of you that don't know, social worker at the Martin James Foundation, plenty of lived experience, TEDx speaker, and a man on a mission to evoke a compassionate response to human suffering. Please welcome Ian Thomas.
Thanks, Lisa.
Really good to have you here. And I'm going to start us off. We've had quite a lengthy chat and we flow really nicely. So I think I'm not even going to really ask you an opening question. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come in with the international definition of social work as a starting point, because I'm really interested in how that's going to unfold in our conversation in the context of being a frontline social worker during COVID-19. So, social work is a practice-based profession and an academic discipline that promotes social change and development, social cohesion, and the empowerment and liberation of people. Principles of social justice, human rights, collective responsibility, and respect for diversities are central to social work. Underpinned by theories of social work, social sciences, humanities, and indigenous knowledge, social work engages people and structures to address life challenges and enhance well-being. The above definition may be amplified at national and/or regional levels. Wonderful, wonderful. So where do you want to start with that? Where do you want to start?
Yeah, do you know what? Every time I hear that definition, I just feel so inspired, and since I've been a social worker, I like telling people I'm a social worker because I hope that it conveys a message that I care about people and that the well-being and rights and interests of people, despite, your identity or culture or nationality, ethnicity, it doesn't matter. Just the fact that you are a human being and that you are a person means that, value should be placed on you, and your own interests, needs and well-being is central to that because you're a person. And for me, that breeds equality. So I like that definition. I feel it's in line with why I went into social work. It's a very big abstract concept though, isn't it? And to sort of narrow that down a little bit, I think is a whole kind of it's a degree, isn't it? That's why you do a degree when you become a social worker, but I think that in practicality terms, for me, social work is about getting alongside people, trying to ascertain, what their wishes and feelings are and their choices, and empowering them to uphold that wherever possible, and it's about managing narratives, what is that individual's narratives, and then, helping them harness that narrative and negotiate their way through a system with lots of different people with lots of narratives, and safeguarding is always at the center of that. Are people safe? That's always been the priority. Social work is something that hasn't always been, it's been a huge part of my life, from a personal and professional perspective. And I kind of feel like I've been on both sides of the fence. And I think that social work is in an interesting time of itself. And I think in respect to sort of COVID-19, one of the strengths that have come out of this is that, the nation are behind the NHS and frontline practitioners, mainly, health staff, but, they're getting a lot of recognition at the moment. And I think that that's really important because they really do life-saving work. And I feel that it's...
But tell me, Ian, I've got to ask you this, right? has it not just irritated you just the teeniest weeniest bit? I mean, I've worked in public service all my life. So 30 years I've been either working in public service or around public service. And I can't lie. It's really uncomfortable for me to see people suddenly understanding that public services are the infrastructure of a country, not the banks and not the corporations, but actually public services. And there's a part of me, and I've got to own that part, that yes, I go and clap the NHS, but I also equally feel uncomfortable about doing it because it doesn't feel authentic. And because I've always valued public service, it's part of my heart, public service. And seeing people who didn't understand anything about public service and actually fought to starve public services all of a sudden acknowledge it. I mean, on one side I'm really glad you're on that journey and it's lovely to watch that, and on the other side I feel cross is the truth. There's a cross there.
I mean, what I was about to get to was, sort of two things. One, the point that you've just raised, and two, the point is that the newfound gratitude is very geared up towards health services and not social care services. And health and social work, health and social care are conducive. One impacts the other. And I hope that this is the beginning for social care to get more recognition, and I do agree with you. I feel that it kind of feel, through having worked within services over years now, probably the last 10 years, professionally I've been involved in health and social care. I've worked in a hospital in a social work assessment team, and the challenges that we faced in the hospital day in, day out, as a result of austerity measures, as a result of public perception, as a result of what felt like a deleterious rhetoric pumped out by mainstream politicians, that had little or nothing to do with the day-to-day work, more the unsophisticated, political philosophies around economics, that didn't really represent the people that are mostly impacted by them. That's and it does feel a little bit, and I feel that people are here because people have just suddenly been taught to really, really get behind the NHS because that's been the focus. And prior to that, the focus was something else, and the NHS was a bit of a political football, and it was kind of used as a way of point scoring and all the stuff around privatization and the economics behind it, which is really frightening. And I think that, it's a wave that I want to surf because, it plays in favor of the benefit and well-being of people, and it provides recognition, that has been long overdue. But I also think that, it finally shows us, if we just step back for a minute and see the edges of this, the reason why we've had so many challenges within the NHS is because of the centralised power systems and the way they treat it, talk about it, and kind of narrativize it. And the minute they change that, once a week, we've got the whole nation still on their doorsteps clapping. And
Absolutely.
That's coincidence.
Yeah.
And if you dismantle the architectures of the rhetoric leading up to where we are, and I mean, I'm not going to get into a Brexit debate or discussion, but that's what's behind it. Nothing's changed other than the centralized power system has told us to change our focus, and we have. And as a result of that, it means that the NHS is getting some recognition. I think it's really interesting that Boris Johnson is in an NHS hospital, and I wonder what the long-term implications of that may be.
I think it's great because what we're watching when we look at Boris on his journey, and he's been on such a big journey in the last few weeks. I think it's fascinating that he's in an NHS hospital. I think he is not going to be the same again. Now, I'm not saying he's going to have metamorphosed into something completely different, but he's had experiences that change you within. And he also has a child on the way while this is all going on. So this is going to shift him maybe not in massive ways, but in ways that are beneficial, I think, to deepen his understanding of humanity, and actually his understanding about how people actually live. And I think that's something that was really interesting to watch, when we were looking at how we're going to be supported economically. And it was like watching people for the first time start to understand how people live in the country. Different people, how do they live, how do they make a living? And that complexity that you talked about at the beginning around your passion around social work, I wanted to unpick that a little bit, because I do think that people like to think of social work in a kind of linear, simplistic way, because actually thinking in a linear and simplistic way is much easier than thinking in a complex way, because there aren't easy answers often to the work that you're doing as a social worker. It is a messy, grey, complicated space. So I'd like to unpick that a little bit, and then I would like to move us into social justice, because I think that's something that stands up very much in that definition. And I don't know how many social workers, depending on when they had their training, would feel that resonance with social justice and activism in equal ways. But anyway, so
Okay.
complexity, yes.
Okay. So yeah. So I think that social work, you know, is it's a regulated, you know, for those who don't know the infrastructure surrounding social work, you know, so it's a regulated profession, and there's a new regulation now called Social Work England, you know, and they have a set of guiding principles, standards of proficiency that all social workers must subscribe to in order to you know, work within professional boundaries. And obviously, as diverse as people are, so must our care be, and as diverse as social workers are, so are the personalities of the social workers, and values and worldviews and pathways into social work. So, you know, there needs to be some consistency across the profession. So that's what those values are designed to do, you know, and they're normally along the lines of anti-discriminatory practice, upholding human rights, respecting people's right to self-determination, and keeping people safe, you know, in all cases. And social work can get a little bit complex when, you know, human rights says that we have a fundamental human right, that we have the right to a private and family life, you know, but then sometimes that has to be infringed in the case of maybe a section 47 under the Children's Act, where you go and talk to a child, or do an inquiry of a family where a child may be at significant risk of harm. So it's, you know, the legislations and the rights overlap, and that's probably a broader discussion. So now the thing is that social work has been on a very interesting journey. You know, its philosophy starts from Immanuel Kant, you know, who said that people need to have the right and autonomy to meet their own ends in life, and not be used to meet other people's ends. And social work was very much on empowerment and stuff. So if you chase the principles and the values of social work, it goes back to Kantian thinking. Now, and in over the sort of the 60s and 70s and 80s, the whole sort of feminist movement, you know, which has been, you know, and Karl Marx's sort of ideas and stuff around people and economics and society, and, you know, and more egalitarian society, which, but now I think the last sort of 10 years, maybe 20 years, social work has very much public perception is it's been owned by the state, and people see social work as social services. So whenever you tell someone you're a social worker, they think that you work for social services, and that you probably take babies away, and that you probably put your nose in where it's not wanted. And I'm not saying that those scenarios have never happened, but social work is a standalone profession, and the government buy into that service, buy into those philosophies, those ideas, you know, that knowledge base of theory and kind of methods, underpinned by sort of empirical research and academia, you know, to justify the decisions and the values and the ways of thinking to understand human growth and development. The government buy into that. And I think that what's happened is over the last 20 years, and I think austerity measures have really amplified this and accelerated some of these challenges, is that social work is about representing the people for the people. It's about human rights, empowerment, respecting right to autonomy and self-determination, and supporting people to exercise that. But the challenge has been is that within governments and austerity measures and public perception and the narrative of the media, which is a very multifaceted, you know, situation, it's in danger of, and in some cases I believe has become, there's been sections where it's become a profession that defends the state rather than represents the people. And I think therein lies some of the challenges. And if you ask people what do social workers do, most people don't really know. Not if you cross-reference that with the international definition of social work. People wouldn't really talk like that in that language. They wouldn't talk about empowerment, human rights, liberation, you know, cultural coercion, you know. But most people know what social workers should have done when they didn't do it, off the back of serious case reviews that get put on the press, and they often get scapegoated. So I'd like to see, you know, a lot of the good practice that happens, a lot of the people's lives are improved by that intervention. And I'd like to see more of a public perception that celebrates positive news stories where people are empowered and helped and can live sustainable lives, you know, economically and socially as a result of social work intervention.
So in the context of COVID-19, because if you're working on the front line right now, we know that people who are living on the edge of the cliff before this happened are going to be the first people falling off the cliff, right? And that's globally. But if we think about that within the UK, what implications does that have for social work practice? And what are your thoughts about how social workers will be able to be much more in tune with that international definition through the experience of COVID-19?
Well, I think, you know, social workers need to be supported by their managers and their agency decision makers, because they've got to be accountable, and they can't practice in isolation, because we know that years of research tells us that when social workers practice in isolation, they're not supported, we overlook things, and sometimes we can't keep situations safe. So I think that it's about looking at new agile ways of working, assessing your whole caseload, and kind of really getting to the nuts and bolts of it, and looking at, well, who's most at risk, and then how can we help them. I read an article in The Guardian last week that social workers on the front line are doing like 25% of their workload than before COVID-19, because the referral rates have just dropped completely. Because schools and youth clubs and healthcare, you know, services are a real good, you know, protective factor for vulnerable families. And when things don't seem right and families might need a bit more support, you know, they often step in and make a referral and advocate for them to get that support. And the local authorities are normally notified through those sort of methods. So that's really come down recently, and that's really frightening. And the truth is, Lisa, I don't know all the answers, and I guess as you know, I've been working in health and social care with vulnerable adults and children and families for a while now, but I'm still relatively young, and I haven't been a social worker for that long, and I haven't made, you know, social work decisions for that whole decade, you know, and I think that we're still learning. What I have seen is a lot of good guidance from the World Health Organization, the Better Care Network, the British Association of Social Work, and you know, .gov, about talking to children about COVID, supporting people who happen to have disabilities, working with vulnerable families. I know that BASW released a paper about direct work and home visits with vulnerable families. And what's interesting is that BASW are an independent body of government agencies. You know, they're an organisation that represents social work. And I haven't seen some local authorities and some local authority practitioners that I've spoken to have said to me that they've not been sure what the guidance is. And I think that says two things, really. I think, one, I think that people are frightened and not too sure what to do. And sometimes when people don't know what to do, they don't do anything. And sometimes that can be dangerous as well. So at the moment, I think that we are in desperate need of really good leadership within the organisations and the local authorities that are kind of managing these services, and finding new ways to engage families and to kind of get some face-to-face contact with children, but whilst doing it safely. And the reality of it is, just like the NHS frontline staff are being exposed to the possibility of, you know, contracting COVID-19 because they're supporting the people who are suffering from COVID-19, social workers are also a profession that are out there every day putting their lives on the line, potentially, you know, to try and meet the needs of vulnerable families. Because in some kind of national crisis, you know, I think the further you are away from being white and middle class, the more vulnerable you are to kind of, you know, because the country's not geared up to you so much, you know. And when you watch the news and centralised sort of decisions that are being made, I've not seen anything about vulnerable children or vulnerable young people who depend on youth clubs to divert them from maybe organised crime or criminal exploitation. You know, I've not heard anything about anything in women's refuges who are fleeing domestic violence. Now, I know that there are forums where these things are being thought about, and, you know, services are trying to respond to these, but the main focus isn't that. And I think that social work's role is to keep that focus. It is to remember people in need and recognise that vulnerability and respond to it.
Yeah. And I think what you're talking about is what we spoke about earlier, is around authentic leadership.
Yeah.
And, you know, how this is an opportunity to develop that. And I think one of the things that I'm really seeing is around people having to broaden their perceptions and their lenses about how many different versions there are of humanity and how many different versions there are of human experience during COVID-19. Because for a while we were hearing people talk about, you know, things that they were experiencing as if that was the experience. And so it was really interesting having those conversations where we can start to broaden for people. And I think this is the call for leadership right now, is how you broaden the amount of perspectives and how you encompass and include those perspectives in your thinking. And that's expansive. You know, that's a really expansive way of being and way of thinking. But there were a couple of things that sort of brought us together that are worth perhaps unpicking briefly. I mean, one of them is that we both were in the care system as children, so both on the other side of using services. And the other was that we were both, I was 20, you were 21, we both entered into 12-step programs at that very, very young age. And I've always joked and said that's because I have such a low pain threshold. But I don't know about yours. How did you end up in a 12-step recovery meeting at the age of 21? Because we're very rare. There aren't lots and lots of us, so it's interesting we have that connection.
Yeah, you are right. It is rare, and I'm eternally grateful that, you know, I didn't carry on any longer. And I guess because I couldn't, you know, and I remember kind of, you know, being in a recovery support group and what they used to call the older members old timers, and it could sound discriminatory, but in that forum it's quite an endearing and sign of respect, you know, and to call someone an old timer.
Yeah.
And I remember saying to this guy, you know, they're all old in these meetings, and he just looked at me and he says, "How do you think they got old, Ian?" And that's never left me, you know. And I thought, yeah, if I want to be old, you know, I've got to stay here and keep working at this stuff and taking a look at myself, which isn't easy, you know, even today. And I guess for me, you know, I was, you know, addiction played a big role in my life. You know, I was always obsessed with being distracted and not being with myself, and that took me to really painful places. And I guess as the saying goes, when the pain of doing the same is greater than the pain of change, it's not until then we finally change. And I think that process of sort of coming to a place of I can't do this anymore is quite philosophical in a lot of respects, and, you know, dare I say it, spiritual, you know, and there are windows of opportunity. And at 21, I was in a police station with a solicitor, and I was 8 stone, 6 foot tall. I hadn't changed or washed my clothes for weeks, and the only thing that was holding me together was denial, that psychological coping strategy designed to keep us emotionally stable in unstable times. I had no self-worth or you know, my humanity. I'd just abandoned the humanity within. And I guess this is probably quite relevant to leadership in terms of personal development programs. But I guess this solicitor, she showed me kindness. She saw the humanity that was still within me.
Yeah.
I can't remember what she said word for word, but she just sort of said, you know, Ian, what are you doing? Where are you going? You know, you haven't got to do this, you know. And maybe she saw some potential, I don't know. And I took a deep breath and I sat back in the chair and I said, I don't want to live like this anymore. And I surrendered. And in that moment, I felt the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. It's so bizarre.
I remember that surrender. Now you're talking about it. I remember that moment where I just kind of went to my knees and I just said, I just can't do this anymore. I just can't do this anymore. And I remember being on my own and 20, having come out of care, on the back of homelessness and all that stuff, and just being in this flat on the 8th floor of a tower block that was cockroach infested. And just, like you say, just that sense of, I can't do this anymore. But I love what you're saying about your solicitor, because that's the thing about walking alongside somebody. Actually meeting somebody where they're at comes in the form of so many different people, doesn't it? I mean, you know.
Yeah. And going to back sort of on the thing of leadership as well. Now, you know, we all have agency. We all have the ability, you know, to impact someone, something around us, whether it be picking a piece of litter up off the floor and putting it in the bin to support a cleaner environment, you know, or being the Prime Minister and saying, let's look at the NHS now. Let's show some gratitude for, you know, the people that are saving lives right now, that has been long overdue. And you know, we all have agency. And I think that for me, you know, when I think back to that solicitor, I don't know if she realized her agency. I think that humanity was talking to me. But, you know, if we're conscious about the words that we say to people, the facial expressions that we kind of display towards them, you know, our paralanguage, our persona, our energy, what we choose to focus on, you know, and how we express ourselves to them, that has a massive. And if that solicitor in that police station, you know, was the turning point for me, I always say that, you know, love is the weapon of our choice. Because for me, if she had said to me, you're a bloody mess, you know, we just need to send you back to prison because that's where you came from, that's where you're going to go back to, just lock him up, I was fully prepared for that. Because, you know, my ego, you know, had constructed itself to be ready for that, because I lived in an unsafe world, not only just based on the experiences that I had had, but by the preconceived ideas that I held about the world based on the experiences I had. So any situation I walked into, I was projecting that onto it. That was the blueprint, that was the engine that drove all that thinking and the way I saw the world. But I say that we don't need defenses for love, because no defenses are needed, you know. And I wasn't ready for that response. I wasn't ready for it to come in at that angle. because I hadn't been shown that for so long. And when she recognized the human being within, that changed my world in that moment. And that was the beginning of the end. You know, that was the foundation to, and I do believe that the universe is a better place now. I'm not doing those things anymore, Lisa, you know, and I wonder by knowing that we can influence someone like that, I wonder how many more people we can help. I wonder how many more lives we can influence. How many more paths can we steer in a direction that is conducive to humanity?
But
Right.
one of the problems, Ian, is that of course everybody who's working with people wants that amber nectar. And what's worse is people then also want to see it. And you know, and I know that those seeds are planted over a long period of time. They are a life course of different moments and different things you read and different songs you listen to and different people, until eventually that penny drops and it collides in that wonderful intersection where you want to change, and all of that stuff just comes together into the wonderful explosion that is the beginning of the end. And of course, you know, and I know, because we've both worked with people as well, where you're working like that from that basis, and you may never know your impact, and you have to get okay with that. And there's a vulnerability in that, and there's also, you have to let go of the ego at the end of the day.
Yes.
You know, because you might never see, your solicitor would probably be
Yeah.
absolutely thrilled to hear, but that she'd created that been part of that intersection. But does she need to hear it? I'm not sure she would need to hear it. I think you pitched her right. She probably was just coming from that beautiful place of connection.
Yeah, that's a really interesting, and this is why I say it goes back to the you know, it's a philosophical journey, and like I say, dare I say it, quite spiritual, and you're so right in what you say. That's a really good observation, because I worked a lot with foster carers. I worked for an independent fostering agency for a number of years, and when I did a lot of training and direct with you know, families that looked after really vulnerable children. And they did that because they really wanted to see the fruits of their labor, and they really wanted to know that they were making a difference. And to have a purposeful life, to have to feel like you're doing something meaningful, is a really important part of, you know, self-fulfillment in life. But there's a fine balance between that and kind of being driven by an ego, because somewhere there is an unmet need that you're trying to fulfill through that means. And I think that when we overcare to meet that need that can be possibly unhealthy, I think we set ourselves up to be quite disappointed when our expectations aren't met. And I'm wondering, are we not meant to know? And I used to say to foster carers, because this is all I had to say to them, and these aren't my words, it's something I heard one day, and I can't remember the source, but just because we didn't get to see the flower grow, it didn't mean we didn't contribute to planting the seed, you know? And I remember I turned up at a recovery support group some years later after I got out of prison. And one of the counsellors that were on the original rehab program I went to was at this recovery support group, because he was in recovery himself. And he was just blown away that I looked healthy and that I hadn't been back to prison, that I was living a decent life and just making a go of it, you know, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but I was making a go of it. And I remember he said to me, and this never left me, he says, "This is payday." I said, "Pardon?" He said, "This is payday for me. When I work with people and I see them further down the line and they're doing well for themselves, this is payday." And I guess we can't expect it, but only hope for it, you know. Yeah. And I think when we expect it, it's a bit of a trap, you know, because I mean, you know, I think expectations are a whole different conversation, but I used to work with foster carers and they'd say things to me like, "Little Johnny's been with me 6 months now and he's still doing X, Y, and Z, or he's still struggling with this, that, and the other," you know. And I often think to myself, you know, so you had an idea, a preconceived idea that when little Johnny got to being with your family for 6 months, he was going to be a certain way, you know. And when that expectation doesn't get met, as somebody that is helping, you know, because the humanitarian response to human suffering is definitely playing a role in that. but also because they are vulnerable to having an over, to having a strong need to feel like they're doing the right thing, or for whatever reasons. It's a multifaceted situation. But when that expectation isn't met, they start to question their role within that relationship, and it sets us up for resentment in some cases, and disappointment and disillusionment, and we start to feel disenfranchised with what we're doing. And I think that it takes a lot of emotional resilience to help people, despite what the outcomes of that help will be, And I think that and I try and remind, foster carers and helping people, and when I say I remind them, I forget this myself. Like, we can only influence through the intervention. We can't control the outcome. And we can make real informed interventions based on lots of research and lots of listening to people who, have had a catalogue of experience of receiving these interventions, because that's really important too, but we can never control the outcome. And the beauty of human life is it's just so unpredictable. The challenge of human life is so unpredictable.
And that brings us back to that whole kind of notion around complexity. We want there to be a simple answer. We want to know that, if this happens, that'll happen. We want to, make sense of things from a very simplistic perspective and point of view. And actually, we are messy. We're complicated. We're messy. The work of humans is complicated and messy. But actually, I would put it to you and to the listener that if we place love at the center of what we're doing, and you've said spirituality a couple of times and said, dare I say, and actually I think spirituality and love are really challenging words for a lot of people, but I can't see how they're not part of a social work practice. If you're doing stuff that you don't know what the outcome's going to be, then, and you're doing that for the better of humanity, that's the act of love. And it's also a spiritual practice, if you like. If it's not about your ego, then it's about doing something that's for the betterment of humanity and for the planet that you're living on. There has been talk, I know, in Who Cares Scotland, they've talked about, I'm not sure if the conversation moved on from, but they certainly started at thinking about professional love and what that means. What does it mean? And I think as long as we have the notion of corporate parent, we're going to struggle with thinking about love, because corporate and parent as two words don't really go together, in my view. And I think make that space messy and murky, and difficult for the child to be walked alongside with by the social worker. And also, is social work now predominantly about support, or is it about punishment and control? And I guess that's a conversation for another day that we can explore. But I definitely think that, like you say, we only need one word from our leadership to change the way we think about social work in that way.
Yeah, social aid or social police, that's a really interesting, and I've got a world of views on that, but perhaps that is another debate conversation for another day.
Yeah. Listen, I've loved talking to you today, and I think there is space for more conversation around particularly the role of social workers in COVID-19, using that backdrop of the definition to see, is COVID-19 going to shift social work practice, perception of social work, understanding of the social work role? Is it going to build bridges between professions who have been starved for so long that they blame each other sometimes? What is the potential for social work out of COVID-19, and how is that going to lead to a more authentic leadership? So thank you very much, Ian Thomas. I really look forward to speaking to you again soon, and thank you for spending the time to talk to me today.
Thanks, Lisa. It's been awesome. Take care.